Okay, that's us in open session, members. We're moving on to agenda item 6. For anyone watching the committee online, we were in closed session because we were receiving a legal briefing, and the convention is that those are done in closed session. So we're moving on to agenda item 6, the proposal to rescind the AERC decision taken on the 3rd of December 2024 not to select and prioritise the review topics on designations and the appointment of the First and Deputy First Minister, and to build on existing AERC work carried out in relation to member designations and cross-community voting. So we'll refer members to the Secretariat paper at page 23 of the meeting pack, and I'd introduce the clerk to speak to this.
Thanks, Chair. So this is a rather technical procedural issue, so I'll just try to cover as briefly and clearly as possible, Chair. So there's a procedural requirement for decisions that are formally taken by committees to be, if they're going to be overturned, as it were, to be done in accordance with a procedure that's drawn from Erskine May, which is the rescinding procedure. Essentially, that requires a prior notice to be given of the proposal, so that a proposal can't be raised at a meeting and decided on at a meeting. It needs to be put on the agenda for a subsequent meeting. And the reason for that really is to give members, so that members, there's not opportunistic attempts made to overturn decisions, and members are given a chance to reflect and discuss within the parties on issues if need be. So this, as you've mentioned, Chair, the decision was taken on the 3rd of December not to select topics 2 and 7 in relation to designations and appointment of FMDFN, as not to select and prioritise those, and that proposal fell. So then at the meeting on the 4th of February 2025, Michelle Guy indicated that she intended to bring a proposal to rescind that decision. So that was recorded in the minutes of proceedings. Michelle subsequently then notified me by email, and that's attached to the briefing paper, that notice. So the committee then, that was the committee receiving the proper notice for the proposal to rescind. That was placed on the agenda for today. So that's really the background to the procedure. So the potential outworkings then, if the committee decides, so that decision to rescind, or a decision to rescind, would be necessary if the committee wants to now select those specific topics for review. So if the committee now agrees to rescind that decision of the 3rd of December, it is then in a position to select those 2 specific topics. There's also, members will see under the next agenda item 7, at the last meeting the committee agreed to for staff to prepare a scoping paper on a proposal in relation to Assembly reform, which is a wider proposal and could incorporate those 2 specific proposals. So if the committee decides now to rescind its decision on the 3rd of December, it could consider those 2 specific issues under the next agenda item, and whether it wants to incorporate those under that wider proposal. If the committee decides not to rescind its decision of the 3rd of December, it won't be in a position then to select those 2 specific issues. However, it would still be in a position to consider the wider proposal under agenda item 7, because it's wider and a different proposition to that which fell on the 3rd of December. So, Chair, I don't know if members are clear on that, then that's basically the background and the way, the potential routes forward on this.
Can I just ask one procedural question, if I may, Chair?
Sure, go ahead.
It's just, if we rescind it, or if we didn't rescind the decision not to proceed with 2 and 7, that would not imply that we didn't want to look at those things, because they're mentioned as part of 10 too.
Yeah, so 10 is a wider proposal, so it can incorporate those 2 specific issues. But the reason for rescinding is really if the committee wants to just focus on those 2 specific issues that the proposal fell on the 3rd of December.
Michelle?
I guess I would think the cleanest thing to do would be just to rescind it, and there's the option for those 2 options, but it's not at all to undermine option 10, and I think we can consider them, but I wouldn't want to end up in a position where maybe we get to item 7 and we look at option 10 and somebody decides it's too broad to meet the scope or something in terms of the strategic priorities, and then we might end up with nothing on the table around reform. So I think the cleanest thing would be just to have that rescinded, and then we'll deal with item 7 when we get to it. That's my proposal around that.
I'm happy to. I have no difficulty rescinding. I don't know if we're moving to form the process, but I would give to my view is that I have no issue rescinding that decision. And I would say that I think that it's can be. I would want to be keen that those topics are going to be covered in what was the previous number 10 on the list.
Just so that members are clear, by rescinding the decision of the 3rd of December, the committee is not selecting those 2 topics. It's just they're back on the table, as it were. Yeah. So yeah.
Separate proposal, is it?
Yeah, so those 2 topics are back on the table. The committee could then decide, does it want to do a review into those 2 specific topics, or does it want to then wait and consider item 7, the wider proposal, and incorporate those 2 specific topics into the wider proposal? Okay. That's if it agrees to rescind the decision.
I was proposing we rescind and then we can deal with that at item 7.
Okay. So the committee now needs to take a formal decision on whether to rescind or not. Do we need to divide for this?
Not necessarily, no, Chair. If there's consensus or broad agreement, or members could register their opposition without dividing the committee if they wish to have that noted. But
okay, anyone wish to speak to that point? No? Seems to be. Can I take it then there's consensus to agree to rescind the proposal?
Mm-hmm. Chair, just for consistency, we'll vote against that. I'll vote against that.
So it's
just for consistency from the fact that we voted against the proposal in the first instance.
Okay.
Just include me in that. Show of hands then, Chair, for those in favour of the proposal to rescind.
Show of hands in favour.
Rescind, sorry. To rescind, yes, apologies everyone.
4 or 5 in favour.
So Chair, I'll just confirm that.
6 in favour?
Yeah, no problem.
Just confirm that, and then those opposed. So just for the records, just confirm that vote. So those in favour are Pat Sheehan, Michelle Guy, Sinead Ennis, Matthew O'Toole, Carol McKillen and John Stewart. And those opposed are Gary Middleton and Michelle McLeveen. And the proposal stands.
Is carried. So the specific topics 2 and 7 can now be considered for review, both of which overlap with each other. So given that the potential overlap between topics 2 and 7 with topic 10, members consider topics 2 and 7 further under the next agenda item, which deals with topic 10 on Assembly and Executive reform. So are we agreed to move to the next item of business then? Mm-hmm. Yes. Which is 7. Agenda item 7. So I'll refer members to the Secretariat briefing paper, page 28 of the meeting pack, and I'd ask the clerk to introduce this item.
Chair, so at the last committee meeting, the committee agreed that staff would prepare a scoping paper on Matthew O'Toole's proposal for the topic on Assembly reform, and this arose from the committee's call to all the political parties in the Assembly and other stakeholders for topic suggestions. So the initial scoping work on the suggested topic would then help inform a committee decision on whether it wishes to undertake a review of the matter. So given the range of the kind of elements, Chair, that this review, we've just give it a working title, Assembly and Executive Reform, because it covers some of the issues would potentially relate to the functions of both the Assembly and the Executive Committee. And of course this committee's function relates to considering the matters in relation to the functioning of both. So at the last meeting, members were also noted that the committee the previous committee undertook initial consideration of some of the elements relevant to this proposal, and that included the issue of designation, cross community voting, and appointment of FM, DFM, and that committee gathered evidence and published that, and in its legacy report it recommended that this committee consider taking those issues forward. Also, at the last meeting, members' attention which was drawn to a debate which took place on the 4th of March 2024, and that was an opposition day debate, and again the issue of reform was debated in plenary, and various issues were identified, and those are listed there, paragraph 5 of the paper. As well, also at the last committee meeting, reference was made to an inquiry undertaken in Westminster by the NI Affairs Committee in 2023, and there's an extract from that committee's inquiry report. It was titled "The Effectiveness of the Institutions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement." That's at Annex B to the paper, and at paragraph 10 there's a summary of the recommendations from that inquiry. So there has been a fair bit of evidence and research gathered already around a lot of these issues, Chair. And if the committee decides to undertake a review on this topic, it may wish to build on the existing evidence and rather than duplicating that. There's a draft terms of reference attached to the paper. It's at Annex E on page 65 of the pack, if members want to take a minute just to look at that. On page 65. So this sets out the purpose and scope, and basically the overall purpose of the review is to build on the applicable work to date and to undertake an up-to-date examination of what institutional reforms could be implemented to improve the functioning and stability of the Assembly and the Executive Committee. The scope of the reviews as drafted in this draft terms of reference would be wide-ranging and could cover any aspects of the functioning of the Assembly and or the Executive Committee with which issues have been identified. However, after initially identifying a range of potential options, the committee may wish to focus on its examination of particular issues of institutional reform. So it's framed widely as drafted, Chair, and then members will see in the outputs and outcomes. The review will lead to an evidence-based report that will inform the Assembly, the political parties and any wider political discussions by providing an up-to-date examination setting out a range of potential options for institutional reform, views of stakeholders on the options identified, an assessment of selected options including considerations for their implementation, and any recommendations which the committee has agreed on next steps. And then the committee's report, as would be normal, would be debated in plenary, Chair. So that's a draft terms of reference. As I said earlier, it's broadly framed, so to allow the committee to incorporate issues. The difficulty with a narrowly framed terms of reference, once the committee might get into the review, it might identify other issues that fall outside the scope of the terms of reference. So yeah.
Okay. Any questions, members? No? Are members then content to proceed with a review of topic 10, Assembly and Executive Reform?
Mm-hmm.
Agreed? Okay. And can we have agreement then on the draft terms of reference at Annex E? Agreed?
Yeah. Agreed.
The Secretariat will prepare a draft plan for implementing the review for approval at a future meeting. Okay. Would ask for agreement to commission research to provide an up-to-date literature review which assesses the available research in this area and to identify additional expert witnesses and other stakeholders from which the committee might receive supplementary evidence. Do you have agreement on that?
Yeah.
Agreed. There will be an overall order of priority for this topic that will need to be considered after all topics have been agreed in order to guide the development of the committee work programme. Agreed? Mm-hmm. Next item of business is agenda item number 8. Assembly engagement on cross-cutting executive strategies, the scoping paper, and refer members to the Secretariat paper at page 68 of the meeting pack, and I'd ask the clerk again to speak to this item.
Yeah, Chair, this item was suggested by the Executive Office in a list of topics that it sent to the committee after the committee went out to stakeholders for suggestions. And then the chair and then deputy chair met with FMD-FM to discuss the list of suggestions received that was on the 3rd of February from TEO, and FMD-FM identified this as their from their list as their priority in terms of the potential for cross-committee and wider assembly scrutiny, helping to break down departmental silos and encouraging joined-up working. So the paper sets out the existing arrangements for cross-committee scrutiny. Now, the paper focuses on committee scrutiny. It doesn't deal with plenary scrutiny of cross-cutting executive strategies, but that's something the committee could consider as it would be a wider review, and if it was thinking about that, it might wish to consult with the business committee and the speaker. But in terms of the way it's drafted at the moment, it's focusing on cross-cutting committee scrutiny. Paragraph 5, that's on page 69 of the pack. It sets out the existing arrangements for cross-cutting committee scrutiny. So there's Standing Order 64, which allows for concurrent meetings of committees, and members will be familiar with maybe that in the past, or one committee can decide to take the lead, or a joint committee can be established. That procedure can be a bit cumbersome. Sometimes it tends to work fine if there's 2 or maybe 3 committees, but if there are quite a number of committees, it could become impractical. There's also the existing option of establishing new standing committees as permanent committees of the Assembly. There's also the option of establishing ad hoc committees, although they tend to deal for specific time-bound terms of reference. There's also practical options around, one committee gathering the views of other committees on cross-cutting issues, and like for example, the Finance Committee would do that when it's reporting on the budget. There's the practical option of one committee inviting non-nominated members. Members of other committees to take part in deliberations, though as the procedures exist at the moment, that's quite limited, although there is maybe a potential for the Assembly to catch up in terms of other places. And I mentioned Erskine May, that's used whenever standing orders are silent on issues. The Assembly uses that in terms of procedural guidance. I've noted that in Westminster that procedure has been widened to allow non-nominated members attending a committee to ask questions, so that's something that could potentially be developed a bit further here. There's also the practical option of one committee inviting witnesses or officials from other departments and public bodies, liaising with the appropriate relevant committee in that regard. So those are the existing options, Chair, the review could look at how those existing procedures have worked in practice and what the experience has been. There has been this issue. We understand has also been raised with CLG in terms of the need for a review of this matter, and there has been previous relevant consideration, for example, going back to NDNA, New Decade, New Approach. There was a proposal in that to establish a programme for government committee to monitor progress against PFG outcomes. So there's a draft terms of reference again at page 76. Chair, if members want to take a look at that. Again, it's fairly broadly framed, and the work could include looking at procedural arrangements and processes in other applicable legislatures in terms of how they go about scrutinising cross-cutting issues at committee level. So again, it's similar type. There would be in terms of outcomes, there would be a committee report to be debated in plenary, which would set out the evidence gathered in terms of experience to date, comparative information, and also identify any potential improvements and additional options.
Chair, please.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, well, first of all, I think this is important, actually. I think this is an important work. I would, personal view is that the previous item we've discussed in terms of would be, I think, a more urgent, but I do think this is worth looking at. One specific suggestion in terms of the terms of reference, if we did decide to proceed with this, and it may be that we decided to proceed with it in sequence with the other one, if depending on the clerk team and their capacity, but there's one piece of law called the I think it's called the Children's Services Cooperation Act, which basically is about statutory agencies supposed to be working together. I wonder if it would be sensible to include looking at that as evidence, as in have statutory interventions to make agencies work better helped. That's just a suggestion to include in the terms of reference, because I know there's other suggestions for others. I've heard it in the chamber. I've probably made some of them myself. Statutory, creating legal obligations on departments and agencies to work together. And I think one suggestion for us to look at is, has that worked? Does that work? But that's just a suggestion. I'm not sure that the terms of reference need to be totally updated, but it's a kind of...
Anyone else?
Sure. I'd be interested to see the scoping paper on it. It's just, I think the option in regards to non-nominated members taking part in committee has kind of piqued my interest a little bit, and I think that could be open to exploitation. So I think we would need to really drill down, looking at this going forward, just to make sure that the parameters around that are set, because I know it says here that it could be, for example, chairpersons or any other non-nominated members could take part. So it's just, we would need to tie down the parameters around that, because I think that could be very unwieldy or could be quite messy if it's not nailed on quite tightly. You could just have any non-nominated members showing up to committees and wreaking havoc if that's how they so wanted. So I think that would really need a lot of examination.
Yeah, Chair, the way it works at the moment is it would be at the invitation of the chair, of the committee, and those non-nominated members don't form part of the quorum. They aren't able to vote.
Yes.
As it stands, they aren't able to ask questions. So really, it's very limited at the moment. It's just about taking part in the deliberations of the committee, so the discussions of the committee. Mm-hmm. But the committee would want to look at all that closely in terms of any reforms.
Anyone else? No. Okay, I'll put the question then. If the committee wishes to proceed with the review of topic 17, Assembly engagement on cross-cutting executive strategies. Mm-hmm. Agreed. Okay. Are members content to seek the views of TEO on the draft terms of reference at Annex D, that's page 76, in order to ensure that they cover the issues which gave rise to the original TEO suggestion? Agreed. The Secretariat will prepare a draft plan for implementing the review for approval by the committee at a future meeting. And are we agreed to commission comparative research on the arrangements for cross-cutting scrutiny in other applicable legislatures? Agreed. So next item of business, item number 9, the development of a formal process and guidance on the handling of Westminster statutory instruments, which include a role for the Assembly. That's topic 19, scoping paper. Refer members to the Secretariat paper at page 79 of the meeting pack, and I'd invite the Senior Assistant Clerk, Nick, to speak to this item.
Thank you, Chair. Members, this is another item that was on the list that TEO provided to the committee following the committee's request for that. And at its meeting on the 4th of February, the committee agreed to receive a scoping paper on that. It's quite a technical area, so I won't go into a lot of the detail now, but just to give you an understanding of what it's about, there is an identified gap in the local scrutiny of either subordinate or delegated legislation that is conceived and passed in Westminster, but actually has impact on devolved areas. So depending on the parent legislation, it could be that SIs that are brought through at Westminster actually do have an impact on the way that legislation is then built and used here in Northern Ireland. So the way the system works at the minute is SIs that are made in Westminster that sit in a devolved policy area. Under normal circumstances, the local minister here would be asked for approval for that SI to go ahead, and it would then be for the minister to make that decision and provide that advice to the relevant committee in Westminster. Obviously, that circumvents the scrutiny process of the Assembly having a look at that SI, in that if it was an SR locally here, there would be a committee that would actually scrutinise that. So therefore, the executive have identified that there is a gap there, and you could argue also that it puts ministers in positions where they may be making decisions without the view of the Assembly having been sought or given on that area. Unlike primary legislation, which I'm sure you're all aware of, LCMs, legislative consent motions, that is a much more formalised process where if primary legislation that is conceived in Westminster impinges on devolved matters, there is a process which the Assembly has to go through to allow that legislation, or certainly to provide a view as to whether it consents for that legislation to happen. In Scotland and Wales, there are currently procedures that have the same effect with Westminster SIs. So they're equivalent of legislative consent motions, but therefore subordinate or devolved legislation. There is no process for that currently here at the Assembly. Although the changes of current arrangements would not necessarily fully lie within AERC, because obviously there would have to be agreement in Westminster as to how that was done, the review, perhaps, Chair, could look more strategically, examining the relations between this parliamentary institution, London, Westminster departments and the executive. And the other thing I would mention on that is that we've been made aware that officials from TEO are having discussions with counterparts in Westminster on this issue at the minute. So if the committee was minded to take this topic on, it may well be worth the committee asking TEO for an update on those discussions and where they actually sit with that now. So if you look at there are a draft set of terms and reference that are on page 88 of your meeting pack, and that lays out, as per the other two topics that we've looked at, the work that the committee would propose to take in terms of gathering information on the existing procedures and processes of SIs that impinge on devolved areas in Westminster, looking at the other devolved institutions because they do have set processes in place, and then once that happened, the Assembly, the AERC would make recommendations to the Assembly via a report. So it would be the same as the other topics that we have.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. Any questions for Nick? No? Okay, so are we content to proceed with a review of topic 19, the development of a formal process and guidance on the handling of Westminster statutory instruments, which include a role for the Assembly? Yes. Content? Yep. Are members content to seek the views of TEO on the draft terms of reference at Annex D, page 88, in order to ensure that they cover the issues which gave rise to the original TEO suggestion? Are members content to commission comparative research on the arrangements for the scrutiny of applicable SIs in the other devolved legislatures? Agreed. The Secretariat will prepare a draft plan for implementing the review for approval at future meeting of the committee. The committee now needs to decide on the general prioritisation of the topics agreed for review. Whilst it will be possible to progress some of the work concurrently, for example, commissioning research and seeking written evidence, other work may need to be done consecutively, for example, oral hearings. Therefore, an overall order of priority would be helpful to guide the development of the committee work. Are we in agreement on the general priority of the topic selected for review?
Yeah, Chair,
we got that.
Yeah, Chair, so there's 4 topics now selected. The first one the committee agreed previously was in relation to the arrangements for MLA's participation in interparliamentary and international bodies. So that's the first one. The second one is Assembly and Executive Reform, which is agreed today. And the third one, Assembly Scrutiny of Cross-Cutting Executive Strategies, again agreed today. And the fourth one, Scrutiny of Westminster Statutory Instruments relating to devolved matters. So it's just really a general prioritisation, just so that we, if we need to, that we can develop the work programme accordingly, Chair.
Okay.
My own, if I may, Chair, thank you. Is my own view is that I think, well, first of all, given I think the agreed political, well, mostly agreed kind of political urgency of the political interest in the what was topic 10, the Assembly and Executive Reform one, I think that should be a particular priority. I also think that some of the other ones are important, but a significant amount of the work can be probably simply gathering the information and putting it to us as a committee. And I'm sure, like on things like scrutiny of SIs, I can't imagine that being particularly. I'm sure there will be opinions, but I can't imagine it being particularly controversial. So my own view would be that we should prioritise that agenda item 10, probably then followed by the cross-cutting one, because I think there is a specific delivery, an interesting delivery question there that's important. But that's just my view.
Jill?
I would probably agree that reform proposal 10 would be first. I think probably the least important to me would be interparliamentary international bodies. I think it looks bad to prioritise that one. We've got things like reform in the Assembly, and we've got things around scrutiny of cross-cutting issues. So I think they're probably the two most important for us to prioritise.
Sure. Are they in order of priority, or are they just the agreed priorities that can run concurrently?
Yeah, so Chair, a lot of the work can run concurrently, like commissioning the research can all be done at the same time, but it's just if oral hearings were to be scheduled, and there are maybe quite a few of them, the committee might want to just have that overall prioritisation. It would just help us to guide the scheduling of work,
Okay. Michelle?
Chair, thank you. I think there's obviously agreement generally that the Assembly and Executive the review of the Assembly and processes should take priority. However, I suppose I am concerned that we could get bogged down in that for quite a period of time and therefore not actually report then on other things. And I suppose if there is a short, sharp piece of work that could be done concurrently on a couple of those topics, so that at least intermittent periods during our time here, that we can report on something, because I'm guessing that the larger topic could take some time.
I mean, there's been work done as well on the larger topic. We're continuing the work from the last, I think, AARC. But I agree, yeah, we wouldn't want to impede other work happening. So I think it's the concurrent, and absolutely if something short and sharp can come through from the others, I don't think there's any issue with that.
There doesn't seem to be a lot of disagreement. Do you fancy summarising that?
Okay, Chair. So Chair, if on the basis that where possible, concurrent work will be undertaken by the committee, but an overall kind of order of prioritisation in terms of first Assembly and Executive Reform, secondly Assembly Scrutiny of Cross-Cutting Executive Strategies, third Scrutiny of Westminster Statutory Instruments, and then finally the MLA participation in interparliamentary bodies. So if the committee was content with that overall kind of order, but on the basis that where possible, any work that can be done and completed and on the lower priority items will be done, and brought forward to the committee where possible.
Are members content with that?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So next item of business is correspondence. Item number 10. Refer member to the item of correspondence on page 91 from a member of the public on the Cubby Sensory Hub rollout. Take agreement to note that correspondence. Great. Next item of business. Any other business? Members, any other business? No. Okay. Final item is date, time, place of next meeting. Next committee meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, April the 8th, 2025. At 9:30 a.m. in room 21. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.
Committee Room 21. Sound.